Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Secret Origins of Mint Condition. I am one of your hosts, James, and this is our second Halloween episode for 2024. So, welcome, audience. And we're finally doing something that we talked about doing in year one of the podcast. But 3 years later, well, actually, we're in season
Plus
4
years.
now of the podcast. So,
Whatever.
to 4 years later, we're finally getting to it. But before I get into the topic, let me introduce the rest of our guests. Of course, Joe is here.
Hey, folks, how you doing?
And Chris.
Hey, y'all.
And returning guest, friend of the show, our quiz was, we say, the questioner, the mutant power of questions. Josh Murray is back with us.
Oh, hello.
And we're gathered to, like Joe and I last year, went into the Florida Bayou and talked about the roots of SwampThing with issues 1 through 12 written by the great Len Wein and drawn by the great Bernie Wrightson. And this week this Halloween season, we are returning back to the Louisiana Bayou to once again visit SwampThing, but under the penmanship or the hand of the great Alan Moore, or the great Alan Moore for the time when Alan Moore was great.
It will be discussed by those of us who are average.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm sure he would appreciate our critique of his work.
Yeah, I'm sure he will. I mean, this was what I was doing my history. So audience, we are going back to SwampThing. This will hopefully be a series of podcasts. Hopefully, it won't take another 4 years or 3 years to get to it.
Yeah, wow.
But we are starting with Volume 1 of Alan Moore's run. Josh, you have it right there. You have the book right there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're doing that book.
Nice.
That's issues 20 through 27. There, Joe's got the original issue 20 there.
Oh
man.
Awesome. That takes care of one of my questions. I was going to say, was it individual?
Oh yeah.
So there we go. One question down before we even started.
I have all of them here.
And so this is going to be issues 20 through 27 of the Alan Moore run. I think since this is our first Saga of SwampThing podcast, we'll probably take a little time just to go over our thoughts about the Alan Moore's taking over and initial impressions. But then we'll just dive into 20 through 27, and we'll try to give as much history as we can leading up to it, because audience, if you've read it, I know we all dived into it recently. I've read it. This is probably my 5th or 6th reading of it. Joe, you said you haven't read this since it first came out.
That is correct. Yeah. 4 years ago.
Chris, how many readings?
This was my second reading, but it was also my first reading was very recent. It was I don't know that it was in the past year. It was probably within the past 2 years, because I went on a whole SwampThing tear when I finished Alan Moore's run, and then I went into Justice League Dark. I went into the recent SwampThing, which I enjoyed. So I went on a whole tear for a while. So this is my second read, but second within the past 2 years or so.
Okay. And Josh, how many times have you this reading?
This is the second time through for this one. I've only read maybe the first 3 volumes, but I didn't get into SwampThing until I met you guys. So I feel like me and Chris are very on the same thing. And so Swamp. I know that because of I'm such a sucker for religion and stuff like that. That Daredevil's kind of my guy, but what affects SwampThing speaks to me on a level that Daredevil is it's cool and awesome, but I'm oh, this guy's speaking into my soul from inside out and making me question what it is to be human and stuff like that. It's awesome.
God, yes.
I love it.
So let's piggyback on that for a moment, Josh. Because this I would say we started a friendship through our mutual friend Josh Bernhard through his podcast Trash Compactor. And it was one of the Boba Fett episodes where we were on together, and we dragged our conversation into the discourse for that, and then our conversation turned more to comics, and we left the discourse and became friends.
It's exactly it.
Outside of the discourse, or the Discord rather, and but you really gravitated towards SwampThing, and especially this run. I think this is the only run of the character you've been.
Yeah, I know. Joe mentioned that he loved the monster stories of, I guess before this, but I never got into those yet.
That is Bernie Wright's story, yeah.
Yeah, and so, I think somewhere along the lines, I maybe made a Watchmen reference or something like that, and then you were saying, did you ever read Alan Moore Swamp Thing, and that was the first time I even heard the two names like in the same sentence. I didn't know Alan Moore had anything to do with Swamp Thing, but then so I was like, oh, I'll check it out. And then when basically Swamp Thing's just a like a deeper dive into like a Dr. Manhattan type character where it's like they transcend into something different and they're trying to make sense of it, then I was just like I was so hooked and I just like couldn't get like read it fast enough. It was so good, and it made a lot more sense this time on my second read. I'll tell you that much. But I love it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it took me a while because for a long time I had only read the Alan Moore run of Swamp Thing out of context of on its own, and then in the recent history, DC has been doing omnibuses for I guess like the last 10 years, if not more.
Is that what this is?
That's a single trade, but they made
Okay.
the whole but they made the whole Alan Moore
Yeah.
they made a box set of the
One of those
trades.
bricks. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
but DC finally did Swamp Thing, the Bronze Age volumes 1 through 3. So I finally got to read all the stories from series. So there was Swamp Thing that went for a long while, and they got canceled. And then Len Wein, which I read the intro to that book you have, Josh. There, Len Wein, the original creator of Swamp Thing, gives an intro in that book. Like he's the first preamble in there. And Len
You know
Wein,
what? I probably should have. If I'd known that, I probably would have read the preface. I was just kind of breezing through, and I was like, "All right, on to the comics." Had I known that it was like the original dude himself talking, I would have paid it more mind.
No, I think that's actually. I mean, I want to get back. I'm gonna let you finish, James. But actually, I actually did the same thing, Josh, because I love reading intros like that. But I found that unless it's integral to understanding the story, I actually like reading it outside of that context first, and then going back and reading it, because it's like you said, the second read through, you were like, oh yeah, this makes more sense. And I had exactly the same experience, right? Because there's a lot that happens. But I kind of liked reading the story without that background knowledge. I know that's what I've done with any time I see because any of those collected works of like Tim Sale and Jeff Loeb, they always have an intro of some sort, and it's fascinating, but it's nice to read the story without that context and then add the context later. So I'm actually with you on like, no, go back and read it later. It's not going anywhere. And we know that James has read it, so then he can offer that insight. But anyway, go ahead, James. I just wanted to say I'm with you there, Josh. I also have not yet read that introduction for the reason I just explained.
And
I have a question brewing, so when you're done, James, I'm hopping right on
that's
the question train.
I mean, to be fair, this is the first time I read the preamble, but it's also my like 5th or 6th time reading it, and I was like, you know what, we're doing a podcast. Let me be a professional and let me do some homework. So Len just talks. Len gives this classic story that is actually in our 3rd anniversary episode from Jim Chadwick and Joe, where he tells like how the Swamp Thing come about. It's that Swamp Thing story. So I'm not gonna bore you guys with that. But then he also says that Swamp Thing, eventually they stopped making the original run of Swamp Thing, and the only reason they revived the book was because Wes Craven made the Swamp Thing movie, and they were doing synergy. Yeah. So they brought this back with I forget who the original who was the writer before
Marty Pasco.
So Marty Vasco takes over the book. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Is that why there's a Last House on the Left reference towards the end of this? And I thought it was just tongue in cheek, but like Swamp Thing's kind of tied in with Wes Craven.
Yes.
That's it's just a line like where I think they're talking about a house or maybe the orphanage, and they say something that's like the Last House on the Left. I was like, oh, but now it makes so much sense.
I mean, that could be a future episode for all of us is to watch the Wes Craven Swamp Thing movie, which is both it's very true to the comic, but also very of the time they made it. But anyway, I digress. Okay. So anyway, Len picked a writer and an artist to revive it, and then when that artist's time was up, and that went for a while, the movie did so, and Swamp Thing kept going, and then when that writer left, he handpicked Alan Moore because it was the British invasion. This is pre-Alan Moore Watchmen too. This is Alan Moore had not written.
Oh,
Watchmen.
This is before.
Yeah, this is pre his seminal work of his. I guess if you were thinking Alan Moore, that's Alan Moore's probably seminal work.
Yep.
Wow.
I mean, he's done lots of things, V for Vendetta, Miracle Man, but I think when the everyday person who's in literature, you hear Alan Moore, you're going to go to Watchmen in terms of.
I'd agree with that, and I think that's also what most people would decide is it would name his seminal work. So yeah.
Yeah. So, but so this is pre Watchmen, Alan Moore. I would argue that this is just as seminal as Watchmen in
Oh,
terms
yeah.
of
Hmm.
and I would put it up there. And Joe, I'm about to turn to you because you got these in real time. Like you were there in real time reading this.
Hmm.
Like I would argue this is right up there with Dark Knight Returns. You know, Crisis, like the things that reshaped how we think about comics and how comic books could be written. I personally put this Swamp Thing run in there. It's talked with great reverence. I think most people who are into comics will say, "Oh, drop the name the Swamp Thing Alan Moore run." But Joe, like, what's your take? Like, you went through this in real time when Alan Moore took over the book, and like, what was the state of like the comic book community, or what were they thinking at the time?
Well, remember this is 19. It's cover dated January 84, which means it probably came out in November the previous year, October, November. So unless you went to a comic book convention, a local comic book convention that summer, you didn't even know about this. I don't know if there was anything on letter page in 19. I should have pulled that book out and see if they were referencing a new writer. But this is before the internet, obviously, before social media. So people found out usually at a convention or on the letter page. So this was new. I mean, I was reading the book. I was enjoying it. I had no idea who Alan Moore was. You know, I was blown away by it. I mean, it was like it was the most adult comic book I was reading at the time. You know, compared to like Superman or Spider Man, but it was obviously very different, and it was the first like real horror comic that had continuing characters. It wasn't an anthology because most horror comics in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were anthologies. 24 pages, 6-page stories. That's where that Swamp Thing story comes. House of Secrets number 92, right? Full 8-page story. So we had continuing characters and a continuing narrative. And it was just something different to read and very, very enjoyable then and now.
Yeah, I well, I guess we can dive into it. So, audience, before we fully dive into it and start getting into it, spoilers all around. We're going to be talking about all the things in this book.
It's been 40 years. If they haven't gotten to it by now and they're worried about spoilers,
It's like ruining the end of The Sixth Sense, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Pause it. Go read it. Come back to us.
Yeah.
Not our non-sponsor Hoopla. You can find it, but like, don't be mad that we spoiled it.
Yeah, as I always go back to the line what Ian McKellen was like for The Two Towers when he was promoting it, and they're like, "Oh, it's spoilers at your back." It's like, well, the book has been out for 60 years.
Yeah. This is close to that, right?
Yeah.
Two decades short, but
Yeah.
I've got 4 pages of notes, but most of the notes I have are not about plot points or different plot beats of the story. It's about the writing, the art, and the whole milieu of the time and the story. So I don't think I'm
we
going
can
to
just tackle it like normally we do for reviews of anything in this show. We're not a play-by-play. There's plenty of people on the internet and YouTube who do play-by-play, panel-by-panel breakdowns of comic books. We're more here for the meaty subject. I will just say, audience, if you're picking this up and you've never picked it up before and you're diving right in, issue 20 is a little bit of a strange issue because this is like one of the few times where a previous writer has not put all the toys away. So like Alan Moore had to like get rid of the characters from the previous incarnation.
So that's what I didn't know where this like started in relation to like is it continuing from something or is it just referencing?
It's both. That issue 20 is confusing. That's and I remember, Josh, when you first read it, one of your notes was like issue 20 was weird, and it's weird because Alan Moore is like putting characters he's not going to use away.
He's back on the shelf. Yeah,
he's wrapping up. He's wrapping up the last issue. He's wrapping up issue 19, which ended with a big fight with Swamp Thing and Anton Arcane.
Mm-hmm.
And with apparently a ship crashed, right?
Helicopter,
helicopter. Okay.
Yeah.
I think they kept calling it like a ship or an airship, so I didn't know that it was a helicopter at first.
Yeah, it was like a giant. It was like a giant, almost like a shield helicarrier for the time.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and Anton Arcane had all his mutants on there and stuff, and then the end of the book is more setting up for what comes because the government, Sunderland, the company that's been trying to get Swamp Thing forever, finally shoots them dead, which we then find out what that all means. But so audience, that's it. Issue 20 is a little weird. Actually, the collected issue that Josh showed on screen before, hopefully I'll make this into a video, but Josh is showing his collected volume 1. That's the first time it was collected, actually. In previous, before DC
Okay.
started making the Alan Moore saga, that was not collected. So I had never read that book up until modern times either. So anyway, I guess we can just dive into it. We don't have to go in order. Joe, since you got like copious notes, why don't we just start with your first note and we'll kind of dive in from there.
Well, I guess we'll tackle the writing first. I haven't read this in 40 years, and so I was taken aback by how well written it was. And just to get it out of the way, this is miles ahead of anything that's being written today in comic books, I think, especially by the big two, DC and Marvel. Nothing that they're doing now could compare to this. It's beautifully, poetically written. I had expected more exposition because he was switching gears, so to speak. But that issue 20 works without you having read the first 19. So he knows how to hit the plot points, the beats. He gets the narrative over very quickly, and the pace of the story, I found it surprisingly quick. Reading all 8 issues, a lot happens, a ton of things happen, and yet nowhere does it get bogged down. No pun intended. Nowhere does it get bogged down. I'm sorry, I had to do it. Does it get bogged down by exposition, or by these what we'd have now in comic books, where 2 people sit down and talk to each other across the table for 5 pages? It just moves at a breakneck pace, but at the same time, there's so much going on. So that's the first thing that struck me. It's an horrific adventure, but it's a cautionary tale, obviously, about humanity and inhumanity, and how sometimes they're both interchangeable.
Well, it's also like an exploration of what makes a person when you're not a person.
Yeah, it's like I just kept thinking of, was it the ship of Theseus, right? Like if you like, I remember it was kind of cool because that's how in WandaVision, I know that's Marvel, that's like the last fight they
Right.
had, where they just discuss like, so if I'm remembering it correctly, the ship of Theseus is like they would like parade a ship ceremoniously from whatever, the Iliad type war and then Trojan War, and then but over time they would have to replace parts of it as it aged, and so the philosophy was like, at what point is it still the same ship that it was? If you're replacing it piece as needed over 100 years, eventually you're going to have a whole new boat. But is it still the ship of Theseus, which is like basically what happens with this, right? He replaces his lungs with fake like yams and kidneys with the like, and so he doesn't have anything that makes a person.
Mm-hmm.
But is the person like, is he still like a have personhood, like the humanity, which is like, I mean, normally I don't go for like heavy-handed imagery, but him having like a nightmare in purgatory where he's wrestling out his own skeleton for the sake, like, because that's how he's saving his humanity. I was like, to me that just rang so true of what that nightmare would look like in real life, so I didn't mind how heavy-handed it was, because there's no way to not be heavy-handed when you're talking about like how do you save your own humanity from like the depths of hell. And it was I don't know, it was, I just love it. I'm gonna go on a rant, so I'll get back to Joe because he had like more
No,
notes.
I'm really glad you said that, Josh, because actually, James, I know you said we're not going to go through panel by panel, and that's definitely not my intention. But I was literally looking at that very thing, Josh, as we were talking, because that was the thing that there are 2 big things that struck me in rereading this from an artistic standpoint. One is when Etrigan makes his entrance, and you just have like almost a full panel of Etrigan leaping in, and then to the bottom right hand corner, where towards where he is leaping, you have a horrified what's her name with the white hair,
Abigail.
Abigail. Abigail Arcane. You have an horrified Abigail Arcane, and a very surprised Swamp Thing, right? So that image in particular is one. But 2 is that entire, while he's kind of like inert and dreaming, that whole thing he goes through of trying to save his humanity, of trying to carry it, the notion that like I love the imagery of he is one with the earth. He's just this like slight mound of earth stuff, while he is simultaneously wrestling for control of his humanity, which is a skeleton. So it makes sense, like you said, Josh. It's heavy-handed. He can't stand without his backbone, without his skeleton, without the bones of who he is, of what we all are, which is our humanity, right? And then him literally going, you know what? Like, no matter what else I have to give up, even if I'm left with nothing but a skull and a spine, I'm going to carry this with me. And the way even I thought that he's portrayed carrying it brutishly, almost, almost impishly, right? Like a monster carrying a dead thing. But he clings.
Because he like has I don't know if it's Abigail actually.
It's Linda. It's Linda.
Linda, yeah. So he's holding Linda in that same kind of way, and then just swaps her out for his own humanity, which is which was so crazy. But it's also like I don't mean to keep showing photos because for the people listening, so all you listeners, can you see this? No, but it's like borderline like Shakespearean, right? Like that's the reference. Totally. He's like talking like, and you're just like, so it's like if David Lynch directed a Shakespeare play right now. It's the craziest thing, and I absolutely love it. Like because it's like weird, but at the same time you get it. It's not weird for weirdness sake. You get like what he's going through, and my favorite volume, and I won't go veering off, but in volume 2, I think it is, when he kind of descends into like the green again to save Abigail, and he just talks about how like he almost wants to give up on his mission because he's at such peace when he's like melted into the earth that he like almost has to remind himself like, oh no, we're doing something, because and that's, I feel like, what Woodrow, right? That's kind of like what he gets when he like puts like reads the brainwaves off of Swamp Thing, and he learns that Swamp Thing permeates everything. So right, he's like,
and
so
right,
at the same time, he's in Africa and he's in Amsterdam and he's like all over the place, and it like, I feel like it gives him the same thing that it gives Swamp Thing, just on the flip side of the coin, where he'll tear the world down to preserve it, whereas Swamp Thing knows that if you tear the whole thing down, you're not preserving it, because it's like a symbiotic relationship, right? Like, we're giving them air, they're giving us stuff, and just that realization strikes him so deeply in his core that he's like, you know what? All right, I'm done. I give up. You're right.
Well, but like, that's just it. It doesn't strike him in his core. It's not Woodrow who gives up. It's the green that goes,
yes.
Oh, that's right. Like, we actually can't survive without the carbon dioxide that all meat exhales. So that's why. So the green leaves him. He doesn't let go willingly.
Oh, yeah. And what's crazy about that is you had the Justice League all like stumped, right, completely, and they're not immediately jumping to how do we fight it. Like, they are trying to problem solve. It was the first time I encountered Superman being like God level, where he literally says he could count the molecules of air on all of the Earth, and so you're just like, okay, I thought he just like froze stuff with his eyes and like melted doors. Like, I didn't know that he was like counting like individual molecules of air level of like good. But like, so they're kind of like trying. It's almost that thing that like, if you're a hammer, you only see nails, right? Like, everything's a nail to you if you're a hammer. And I feel like that was kind of like what Justice League was going, and then Swamp Thing was kind of meeting it like philosophically, like almost like there's no amount of superpower or people on this earth that can fight this. So he didn't even like try, and he doesn't even know his full powers at this point. He's just using almost like the logic of his humanity that the Green doesn't have, and so he's able to say like, no, you need them as much as they need you, and then
you exactly. Yeah. It's symbiotic. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's well, there's a lot to unpack there for you.
You want me talking endlessly?
Directions? Yeah, I mean, that's a great cover. I mean, that's like, I think Alan Moore's first attempt at like what will become Watchmen is sort of putting feet of clay with the superheroes. They're sort of so analytical and so in their own headspace that they're missing the
Like-
point of heroicism, I guess.
Like that's straight up Dr. Manhattan right there. Like
Yes,
Yeah.
that
it's like
definitely.
you know, like with the dot. For your listeners at home, it's a panel in which Swamp Man's drawn blue, and he's got a bullet hole right where Dr. Manhattan's.
That's a good point, Josh. I had not
Image,
thought
yeah.
about that for future symbolism, but you know, it's like Alan Moore. Like I said, that's his first thing with like kind of Watchmen-esque stuff. If you're looking at it, but you know, that'll be the theme through Swamp Thing, audience, as we go through this, is that Swamp Thing tends to handle things not with his fist, though I will admit it, he does, like, it does, I wouldn't say devolve, Swamp Thing does use his fist in these issues. Like, he
Yeah.
backhands Woodrow half across,
Yeah.
like,
yeah.
like,
And he says you're too scared to fight like a man fights or something like that. And Woodrow's like, we're not men. Like,
Yeah,
and I think that like changes. He doesn't say it like that, but he's like, why would I fight you like a man does?
and does he,
And
like,
I-
in Swamp Thing, does he physically confront the demon, the monkey
Yeah.
king?
No, he
Or-
does.
Yeah.
Etrigan slashes at him, like cuts his arm off. Swamp Thing very
that's right.
calmly like reattaches it and
Gross-
then
yeah,
hits
yep,
him.
yeah.
Pretty
Yeah,
great.
that was
But the
awesome.
Monkey King and the rhyming guy, sorry, I read this twice, I
Etrigan.
don't even know his name.
Etrigan.
They're not the same person, right? What happened was that the kid in the home, his parents accidentally summoned
Release
fear
monkey.
itself,
Mhm.
and then Etrigan, he was kind of like almost wanting to put that genie back in the bottle, and so that's why like he was fighting Swamp Thing, but like once they accomplished it, then he was just like, oh, I don't.
The
we
whole
don't
thing,
have to
the whole
fight.
thing
Like,
was
yeah.
that this demon, in order to remain on Earth, needed a master. So it named a master, which was the boy, and compelled him to just continue existing. Etrigan was like, great, if I sever the link, I don't have to fight this thing at all. It'll just go back to hell. And that's why Swamp Thing is fighting him, and that's why he went after the boy instead of the Monkey King.
Which kind of shows Swamp Thing still has his humanity, because the other unearthly creature was just like, oh, just kill the human, and the link's done, and we don't even have to do this. And Swamp Thing's like, or
But hold
maybe
on,
hear me
I feel
out.
like
We don't kill
Etrigan's
children.
I feel like Etrigan's a whole thing to unpack. So I want to
yeah.
double
Yes.
back,
Yeah,
Sorry,
double
yeah,
back
yeah.
real quick before we get to Etrigan.
This Etrigan is a little bit far afield of Jack Kirby's Etrigan. There's a difference here, very much.
But the Monkey King, which I did in my research, appeared in the Jack Kirby run of Etrigan.
That's right. Yeah.
He was
Wait,
like he was.
Etrigan, he's his own character. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
Oh,
off.
yeah.
Like he's
Yeah,
like,
there's-
has his own one.
That's
Oh,
a whole
Etrigan?
other
Yeah.
episode.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
man,
Etrigan is a whole character.
I know even less about DC than I know about Marvel. So you're in for it today. Let me tell you.
Etrigan is very much like Etrigan is very much like John Constantine, where he shows up in
Okay.
Swamp Thing more than a lot of other characters do. Like in Swamp Thing, you'll see like Batman, Superman, or Wonder Woman, but not
Yeah.
really a lot. But you will see a bunch of Constantine and Etrigan who show up in other books.
And Phantom
Okay.
Stranger, and but Joe, like,
Well,
I mean, just to kind of like do a sidebar just for the audience for a moment, since we're bringing him up, like
Well,
Etrigan.
Etrigan was created by Jack Kirby when he came over to DC Comics. He wasn't part of the Fourth World. He was kind of like an offshoot of that, off to the side. He's two beings in one. He's Etrigan the Demon, and he's Jason Blood, who's I don't know how do you define Jason Blood? A mystic, I guess. I'm not sure, but
Show that Jason Blood is what's his name, the rhyming guy in this.
Yes,
right?
they do.
They both make an appearance. Oh, they
No,
show him
because
change.
later on when she I think it's when she chases, because Etrigan gives Abigail that warning. She races after him, which is how Swamp Thing ends up with the boy. And when she finds Jason Blood in the swamp, she goes, "You turned in that demon, didn't you?" And he said, "Yeah, two halves of the same body."
Oh.
yeah,
He's
he
going.
was, I
Yeah.
believe Etrigan was tied to Merlin the Magician back in.
He was
King
his
Arthur's
half-brother.
court. Half-brother. Thank you, James.
Yeah.
And that book lasted longer than the other Fourth World books, and then they brought it back again. Originally, Etrigan was a rhyming demon, but the rhymes were early on were very, very simplistic, like "Gone, gone, the form of man, rise, rise, Etrigan." But when Alan Moore gets a hold of him, he speaks in iambic pentameter.
Yeah.
So
More
it's-
Shakespeare. Let's
yeah,
go.
there you go. There you go. So I mean, and it's even mentioned here how Jason Blood was becoming more of Etrigan than vice versa. Moore mentions that in one of his issues. So
Yeah, he does. At the end, when
Yeah.
Jason Blood is describing the the compromise they made that each would try to be more like the other, and he's like, I'm becoming more like Etrigan, and Etrigan is becoming more like Etrigan.
Exactly. I thought that was great. So yeah, it's an original character from the early '70s, but it's like everything else that Moore was doing here. He's updating it. He's putting his spin on it. And
He also gives the tribute. They give the tribute to Jack
yes,
Kirby
they
at the
do.
end.
At the end, yep.
Yeah, which I thought was like, wow. I guess it's interesting seeing some of Alan Moore's the things that he pays tribute to through this run, because he pays tribute to a bunch of different things as you go through the entire saga of Swamp Thing as we go. So, well, I guess I wanted to tie it back to kind of where we devolved from. We were talking
sorry.
about,
Yeah.
no.
Okay,
I
no,
just
it's-
no. There's a lot to unpack in the series, but I just wanted to ask, when I was like reading this, and maybe I think I'm reading it directly, but maybe it's more nuanced than that. Is like when Swamp Thing is battling for his skeleton in like the purgatory of his own mind, or the purgatory of the green. Ultimately, though, Swamp Thing, I always took it that Swamp Thing is the soul of Alec Holland reincarnated in the body of that. Or do you, or is the other thing that he doesn't even have the soul of Alec Holland? He is just a plant that has the consciousness of a man. Like, I don't, like, what do you guys take it as?
Well, so what? So it seems like if Woodrow's research is to be believed, that pesky Woodrow, that there's like worms that like they taught like a worm how to do a maze.
Planarians.
Chopped up that worm, yeah, and fed that, and then they all learned, right? So I guess what he's proposing is that like Alec Holland blew up in a fire, whatever, in the swamp, decomposed, and the same thing, whatever happens with the worms taking on the knowledge passed down from what they ate, is kind of what happened to Alec Holland. Like the worms like ate him, and then so when they form Swamp Thing, if that's the thing, like the ship of Theseus, like is that Alec Holland, or is it just his memories and whereabouts and all that stuff in these? I don't think it's all the worms, but in the plant life that kind of like ate him up, and that's why um he's like kind of torn. Like, wait, who am I? Am I just a bunch of muck, or am I a man? Sounds like a Muppet song, right?
You see Kermit the Frog singing it, yeah.
But Chris, what's your take on it?
It's okay. You can go first, Joe. I know you also had something to say. I can wait till you're done.
No, what was I going to say? No, I think we all. I know I did. We cut up planarians in high school biology, and it the part you cut off would grow back. So yeah, I think what he's trying to say here is that the consciousness of I almost said Alan Moore of Alec Holland becomes part of the green, and the green coalesces around that, I guess, and the Swamp Thing is reborn. But he's not human. He's not a man, a monster that became part of the swamp. He's now the swamp that became
the swamp. Like, because he even says like she was like, "Oh, you were underwater for a half hour," and he was like, "Oh, once I learned I don't need my lungs, I just stopped using them."
He even didn't have to breathe even before that when he I guess that's what's going on here.
Well, Chris, let's hear your what's your take on it?
So I think it's a worldview thing for Alan Moore when he writes this, because there's this idea from a psychological standpoint and a spiritual standpoint that humans have shared memory, that there are primal memories that we all contain of humankind.
Chris, is that Jungian?
Sorry,
Carl Jung. Is he?
Yes. Yeah. There's some Jungian like psychology there. You're absolutely right, Joe, for sure. And so I think part of what's happening here is this idea that, like, especially when you hit that level of consciousness, going back to what you were saying earlier, Josh, being part of the green, feeling this plant here, that flower here, this tree across the world, this idea that everything is interconnected, because we keep seeing that throughout this book, throughout Alan Moore's run on this book. We keep seeing how everything's interconnected. So I think the idea is actually pretty simple. It's that idea that, matter and energy can't be destroyed. They can only be recycled, right? And so I think that's what we're seeing here is there's this idea that, like, from the earth we all come, to the earth we all return. It's just in this case, it's more than the matter that's returning to the earth. And I think that the memories that Alec Holland had, which that Alec Holland, if we're gonna follow that path, each of us is of the earth, then Alec Holland was already of the earth, and now he has just returned to the earth in a different form, in a completely different. I'm gonna go off on a very brief tangent, but like it relates. And there's a spoiler alert here for anybody who has not watched The Good Place. But at the end of The Good
It's like my
Place,
favorite show.
it's brilliant. Brilliant. And at the end of the series, there is, in the finale, there's this idea of Eastern philosophy of there's a wave. And you can see it, you can measure it, you know what it is, it's a wave. And then the wave crashes on the shore, and the wave is gone. But the water is still there. The wave was just a different way for the water to be for a while, but the water is not gone. It's just back to where it belongs in the ocean in a different form. And so I think that's this idea that each person on this planet is a wave. It's just that when Alec Holland returns to the ocean, the echoes
Screen.
of the echoes of who he is
Yeah.
go into the green, and so they echo more loudly, than maybe other people who go back into the earth. So that's my take
I,
on the whole
Chris,
situation.
your take just like blew my mind because
eh,
I wrote down that this is a book of mysticism mixed with science fiction. But
Yeah.
since you mentioned how matter and energy can't be destroyed, they just take on new forms. It made me think one of the movie we just talked about last week. Uh, 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 Help me here. Ghostbusters,
Ghostbusters,
right?
Ghostbusters
And how,
Frozen
how
Empire.
Melody at the end she becomes part of the universe. So
Right.
there's like some quantum physics mixed in here too. That's going on with this story,
Well,
and
and I think it goes
and
to what Josh was saying, earlier, which is it hits on a spiritual level, which is really interesting.
yeah, I feel like a lot of like what happens in the Watchmen and Swamp Thing is like since Twitter didn't exist at the time, this is just like Alan Moore like live tweeting his existential crisis and breakthroughs just like in art form, and I think it's like so like relatable, right? Like you could
I can
see
get
kind of
behind
like
that.
that the idea of like what is a man, what is like humanity, then it gradually gets to like a Dr. Manhattan, like if you got so advanced, then would the smartest human be the smartest ant to you? And it kind of like now how what level of detachment does that removal of humanity give him? Because that's similar happens to Dr. Manhattan, right? He's basically evaporated, and then his like energy and memory, like and consciousness, kind of form into this creature that or godlike thing that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger the more he unlocks, which happens kind of with Swamp Thing. And like he just keeps unlocking, like, oh wait, if I'm not a human, then I can just like attach my arm again. I could do all these things. I could lift up the earth to flood out vampires. Spoiler alert for
Well, I guess
volume
like
two.
Swamp Thing, like I think like the whole now kind of deviating. Some of this will come later, but the green, like Alec Holland chooses to come back to humanity because he recognizes there's a presence in the green that doesn't belong, and he also, I guess, he kind of recognizes that this presence is doing things to imbalance the earth. So he like sort of like I said, like he could have stayed there forever. He kind of leaves
Yeah,
paradise to, I guess, reluctantly or unknowingly take up the avatar role of the
yeah,
green, which is not what he. I mean, the premise that Alan Moore explores more is that there's always been an avatar of the green. Alec Holland's the current embodiment of that avatar,
right.
and
okay.
the avatar of the green needs to understand the balance of humanity versus the green, and that's why
I love it.
Woodrow like got lost in his stuff. But Alec Holland is not like told like it's like depending on your version of Swamp Thing, there's been so many versions of Swamp Thing that build off of what Alan Moore did. But sometimes I keep saying Alec
Alan,
Holland
I do
is
it too.
Alec Holland in this iteration is not told any of that. He is just like discovering it on his own. Like,
On it, yeah.
I I'm in this position, which he doesn't even say for some reason. He's just sort of grappling with the fact that I'm in this position, and
Mhm.
what does that
Yeah.
mean?
Well, the one thing that was really that just like erupted a bunch of light bulbs in my head is like you're talking about him leaving the piece of the green, And I saw an interview on, I think it was YouTube or Masterclass or something like that, with David Mamet, who equally parts brilliant and troublesome at the same exact time. So, but he is one of my favorites. I will own that. But he did an interview where he was talking about the hero's journey, and I was a sucker for it because he used images from the Bible, and he said that like Moses going up to see God in the burning bush, that's not the hero's journey. Leaving the presence of God to go be back with man and fix what they're doing is his hero's journey. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane
Right.
praying that he doesn't have to go through with it is not
Exactly.
the hero's journey. The hero's journey is leaving the Garden of Gethsemane in peace to know what is about to happen. And so
Right.
I think that there's something very amazing about the being at like in a level of peace and like transcendedness that we would never be able to fathom, right? That's what he's trying to tell us is happening with Swamp Thing in the Green. And he's conflicted at first, but he's also at peace. But then to protect that peace, he needs to take care of the bad presence there, which also in that symbiotic relationship is also helping humanity too. So it's like equal parts like caring and selfish at the same time. Like to preserve his peace, he has to leave his peace. But the byproduct of that is he saves the earth from exploding and killing everybody, thus also destroying the green. So it's like I don't know how this man thinks of this stuff. Like it blows my mind. Like when I'm reading something and it makes me like put it down and like how is this possible? How is this man thinking of this?
Well,
That's like what I love the most.
I think he's tapping into archetypes because the hero, the reluctant hero, leaving behind part of his or her humanity. That's a story we can all recognize because
Yeah.
it's part of. And you go back to what you were talking about before, Chris, the collective unconsciousness, right? Again with Mr. Jung, right? So yeah. I mean, he's tapping into all of this. So yeah,
I also thought he did like a really not that because you guys have Josh and Chris, you guys did an episode of Trash Compactor where you talked about like mental health in Star Wars. I thought Alan Moore, like, I've never been that level of depression, but the fact that he had Swamp Thing rooted himself to the ground because he was so
Yeah.
depressed
that's
over the
very
loss of
depressed.
his identity. Like, it's sort of like for me, like, the image of like that level of depression. I thought, to me, like, I thought it was very brilliant or a very artistic choice of like, this is how far it can go when you really lose yourself.
Yeah, I'll tell you one thing if I could find the. So again, I'm so sorry for the listeners at home, but it's the cover of I guess the episode Swamped, and it's kind of like Swamp Thing is like it's like a bog, but you see the vague form of Swamp Thing, but he's just kind of like drowning in like the water and the swamp, and he's just like draped over and stuff like that.
Mhm.
I would say that the person who drew that knows what depression feels like. Like that's like if you were to like kind of like put it into a picture, like I know, yeah, there might be like darkness and all this other dark imagery, but that kind of like uh so slight tangent, but I swear it's connected. So recently, after 41 years on Earth, I got diagnosed that I was undiagnosed with ADHD my entire life. So as you can tell, as I bounce around, all the listeners are like, "Yeah, no, duh." But so and like so why I like hyperfixate um on everything, and so it's just like the the feeling that it's described is like chronically feeling overwhelmed. Like that's and I know everyone's like feels like they're drowning all the time, but like just imagine that as like a chronic condition. And like by that it's like so if I'm like in a place like I'll be hearing like every conversation all at once, like in the same amount of focus as the clinking like dinner plates and stuff like that. So it's just like chronic like overwhelmedness, and I feel like a lot of times that is what mental health in its various forms brings to the table, and so that kind of leads to that kind of like shutdown of like I just want to melt into the couch and be in solitude, be sunken into the green. But like at the same time you need to find that balance because James, like you're saying, if you grow roots in that and you're just cemented there and you're you're not almost like I don't want to say not doing your part because that puts the blame where the blame shouldn't be for it, but for lack of a better term, if you're not doing your part, that's very easy for that to happen, and that would be almost it would be working against you in the same way of there being like Woodrow in the green, like invading your piece, like
Well, and I think
that.
it's sorry,
Yeah.
finish what you're
So
saying, Josh. Didn't mean to
no,
interrupt.
that's part of the diagnosis. I just stopped talking in the middle of a sentence, so it's all you, man. I just
No, I mean, I
I,
think you can see imagery like that a couple of times, right? That notion of feeling overwhelmed, whether it's by like ennui, which is what happens when he sort of melts into the green, or just or just being overwhelmed in general. Much like how when he's talking about there is a beetle and the beetle is stronger and the beetle is smarter, but there are more ants. And at some point, first there's a beetle, and then there's just a beetle-shaped mass of ants, and that's when he's being
yeah,
hunted. That's when he's being hunted by the government, by the military, and he starts saying there are just too many ants, right? So I think it's that similar.
yeah,
Go ahead. Yeah, I see
yeah.
your hand there, Joe. What were you?
Well, I was thinking again. My mind keeps getting blown here. Since these are comic books and they're quote unquote written for children, and there's a lot of metaphors obviously all over these 8 issues. Could part of this be a metaphor for adolescence? You know,
Oh yeah,
I
I mean,
mean,
yeah.
right? I mean,
I think
especially
that's a
the
great
way it
point, Joe.
ends. Yeah, especially the way it ends. Like we were talking about the hero's journey. Like one of the last page, there's maybe like 2 pages after it is the kid that kind of like saves the day by learning
yeah,
not to be
that's what I
scared.
think. Yeah,
But he asks Swamp Thing like, "Were you scared?" And Swamp Thing goes, "Yeah, I'm scared. I was scared. I don't like fire. I was scared." And then the kid is saying like, "Well, if monsters could get scared, I guess it's not such a bad thing that I got scared too."
yeah.
Like it's no, that's right, Joe. That's right there. That's spot
That's like
on.
one of
That's
my
great.
favorite lines in the book.
Uh
The other favorite line in the book is, again, we're all over the place, audience, but it's fine. Is a
huh.
is this I always this has stuck with me since I read it. His description of the Flash, was it the man who is so
Who sees
fast that
everyone in
every the whole world is what
a
a
statue?
gallery of statues. I'm like, oh
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
a great
Yeah,
line.
that's like a
I
poet.
loved
That's
his
like
approach.
such high level poetry
Beautifully
there.
written. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, like,
the writing, the prose is just exquisite. It really
all of
is.
his descriptions of the Justice Leaguers is very poetic and very spot on.
Yeah.
Was I think was is the one for Superman is like what Josh was saying, like he can see everything and
Count all the
Uh,
molecules. And, you know,
yeah.
yeah, so Superman himself says that. I'm trying to find the description of
But just kind of to
um
go, Josh, while you're finding that is like just to
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
speak to like some of Alan Moore's stuff with writing the Justice Leaguers is like he writes to the super in the man, Joe, right? I'm like he like Superman in some incarnations is like he's not just a super with his abilities, like super intelligence, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
his
He writes the Superman, the Alien. He's not writing Clark Kent. He's not writing Farm Boy. No. And I always push back on when writers like Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, and a few others who I can't don't come to mind now, want to put Superman on this godlike level and have his superpowers, especially his vision powers and things like that, just being completely, totally off the wall and just not stretching the realm of plausibility or whatever you want to call it. So as you know, I'm a fan of Clark as the human guy, and Superman is the fireman, so to speak. But
Yeah.
it works in this story, and it's just a different iteration of Superman as Alan Moore sees him, and it works
Yeah.
perfectly.
There's a man who could see across the planet and ring diamonds from its anthracite.
Anthracite,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's
Very
yeah, that's and then there's a man who moves so fast that his life is an endless gallery of statues.
That's a good.
Ooh, baby.
it's just like so like poetically
Which is
like
kind of playing out in the current run of the Flash by Cy Spurrier right now, which is why I don't like it. He's trying to be Alan Moore. He's trying to be Alan Moore, Cy Spurrier, and he's not.
It's so funny. So like my probably my favorite writer, like he's not on my Mount Rushmore because he's the mountain in which my Mount Rushmore is carved, is Cormac McCarthy. And the best writing advice I ever got was do not read Cormac McCarthy while you're working on a project because subconsciously all you'll do is become a bad imitation of Cormac McCarthy. And I wonder if that's kind of maybe what's going on in your Flash thing. Maybe he's reading too much Alan Moore, and then
It's going on in
just
a lot of
bad
books currently
knockoff.
right now. There's a lot of writers in
Yeah.
comics who want to be Alan Moore, and they're just not.
Well,
And that's
because
okay.
he's like, because he's
Not everybody
Alan
can
Moore.
be Babe Ruth.
Alan Moore, like this run of obviously Swamp Thing, and then many of his other titles like V for Vendetta, Watchmen, like, well, they're like they're the soil in which current comics were grown upon. I mean, so like if you try to write, like it's hard to get like, you don't want to be writing in his voice because he's already done it. Like,
yeah, it's very unique.
And there's a quote by Barry Hannah that talks about there's aspects of writing that you're kind of like born with, like a talent to string words together and stuff. That's like, you could kind of hone it and tweak it, but there's aspects of writing that just cannot be taught and they can't be learned. You just kind of like have them. And I think that's what happens. Alan Moore has something. He knows not only how to tell a story, but how to just say if he wants to talk about adolescence or mental health or something like that, he does it in a way in which he doesn't talk about it, but that's all that he's talking about at the same time. Like it's not even that he describes it, it's just he sees it so much in everything that he knows that you don't have to mention it by name, you don't have to force it, because it is going to come out. Like I don't think Alan Moore sets out to write this deep and rich and stuff like that. I think obviously in editing he tweaks and stuff like that, but I think a lot of it is going to just come out the way he writes, because that's the way he thinks.
It's his world.
So,
yeah. Chris, you were gonna add.
What's wild to me is because this is all, and all credit to, this creative team, right, to put together this book that like we could spend literally so much time going through. We could go through panel by panel. Don't worry, folks, we haven't changed our course here. We're not going panel by panel. But we're talking about all this philosophy and the depth behind it. And then, like you were saying, Josh, like it's not even that like this is necessarily what he set out to do, the condition of man and all that. But like it's a thing that kind of happens. But what really kills me with this book, especially given that we are doing this for Halloween, we really haven't gotten into the horror of this story yet. Because between the artwork and the storytelling, like how striking is it when at this point we don't know exactly what this presence is, but that giant fly that says you're going to have to let me in, right? Like what the Monkey King like brings to life. What it's like watching the Floronic man try and absolutely just destroy all as he puts it, all meat on the planet, right? Mm-hmm. The horror of this book is so beautifully
covering
done.
himself with like fake skin and everything like that. There was a lot of really
when the Justice League finds him and he's a mess.
Yeah, and he's it's like very good comedy that's like there's like an absurdity to it that like threads the needle where it's not slapstick but it's as absurd as slapstick. Like he's trying to like, we know that Superman can, in this version, can count the air molecules on the planet Earth. He can see across planets. And then this guy is barely not a plant, and he's got like makeshift like fake skin on, and things are all growing out, and his arm's like broken, and he's like, oh, it's just me. It's your friendly neighborhood scientist, totally just fooling the Justice League. And so there is like
that scene goes from like absurd, horrific to like sad and pity. Like Superman, and I forget who's with Superman. Is it Green Arrow or
Green Lantern?
Green Lantern is with them.
The two most powerful members come down,
and they're just kind of like, it's okay. We're going to take you back to Arkham.
They are speaking with like a pity, but they're not.
They're very condescending.
Yeah.
I mean, with our spiritual themes, there's like basically like something like with his arms outstretched to hold it. Yeah, it's a
beautifully drawn page too.
I believe Stephen Bissette is one of your favorite artists, right?
I like him, and I like him because of this run, like Stephen Bissette.
Yeah,
because Stephen Bissette, like Chris, going back to your horror, like just talking about the horror a little bit, like, and it's John Totleben too, right? Stephen Bissette and John Totleben.
Totleben does the covers.
Okay, so Totleben and Bissette like set the mood, and Totleben can do some beautiful work. Like Josh just threw up that picture of Swamp Thing with his arms wide and the entire Louisiana bayous behind him, and it looks beautiful. But at the same time, like much like Bernie, a lot of his people, his normal people, kind of look grotesque.
Yeah,
Like,
no.
Yeah.
I
like
also
there are
Yates
no
also does covers too. I misspoke, but but you're right. It's that. Well, I think that's the whole idea because it's as Chris said, it's a horror book,
Yeah, I mean, the only
and
one who looks beautiful is Abby, which she should. I guess she's the only
yeah,
beautiful-looking person in the book. Everyone else, especially when Etrigan's going like person by person and telling them how they're going to horrifically die,
Oh
they
yeah,
they
that was
they look
yeah,
terrible. He looks terrible. Like there's
yeah.
you know,
it's
the
all
Monkey King is morphing into nightmares, much like John Carpenter's The Thing. Like
Oh yeah,
it's like
absolutely.
it's a horror show, but
it's all, exactly.
it's but I don't know, like it's interesting. I gravitating to the philosophy and the horror is just because like I think it's like, again, the tool of Alan Moore's writing is he's doing it with monsters and mayhem to tell you these like philosophical or human truths that he's trying to make weighing an opinion on, or or just get you to think about them.
Yeah, like that was like kind of like Rod Serling's approach too, right? He learned that if you wanted to, speak about injustice that people of color were receiving back in time, you can't write about that. What you have to do is write about like Native Americans and what happened to them, and then like find the similar themes. Because if you hit the nail too much on the head, then people turn off. But if you make them invested in something that kind of like sneaks the fastball past them, but not that they're oblivious. Like it stays with them, and that's the power of like fiction and myth and everything like that. Because you could tell these deep, deep things through a man that's made out of like sticks and mud and moss, and then
Mhm.
all of a sudden we're talking for an hour unraveling the mysteries of the universe. Like it's just, and then at the same time he just grows his arm back too. Like it goes so silly versus so crazy in depth. I just love it.
Well, I think it's like that's a good callback because Joe, correct me if I'm wrong. I think in the Bernie Wrightson Len Wein run, isn't there a time when he does get his arm chopped off for the first time,
Yes,
and he's like horrified and he doesn't know what to do?
it
But now
grows back
now he
over a
just
few panels
nonchalantly
and
picks it up and puts
puts
it
it
back
back
in.
like an action figure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but back in the day in his first creation, like he was like, "What? I lost an arm. I don't know what to like." He eventually learns he can regrow it, but he's like completely at a loss for like what happened to his body.
So so this is the same Swamp Thing as those runs, but in this one, he's just learning his true nature. Rather, before he thought that there was a chance of him being able to be turned back into Alec Holland. Like we did this, we could undo it. But in this, he learns that there is no undoing it. Like
Right.
you're dead if you want to be dead, but you're alive if you want to be alive. The choice is up to you.
Yeah,
You
I
know.
mean, previously the Swamp Thing run up until this run was like the Incredible Hulk or the Wolfman. Like he's searching for a cure. He's a
Oh, okay.
monster. He's a
Yeah,
monster,
Yeah.
exactly.
but he hopes to be free of the monster at some point because there's a human underneath there somewhere. But no, now he's like, there's no human.
Yeah.
There's nothing to go back to. Chris, yeah, you were gonna.
Well, and there's something super interesting too about because Swamp Thing is another one of those characters that, like Deadpool, you can try and die by suicide, but that you can't destroy yourself. As an avatar of the green, like what can you do to destroy yourself? All you can do is go inert or be destroyed by someone or something else. But as we learn, Swamp Thing is so big that even when it's thought he's destroyed, he's dormant, and it's not going to be long before at some point, life finds a way. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and that's spoilers audience again for future volumes. But that's one of the things he deals with is because he eventually has to be at the will of the Parliament of the Green. We eventually learn that there's
Parliament of Trees.
The Parliament of Trees, yeah, and they oversee like the Green basically, and Swamp Thing is their avatar. And
Ooh.
if he doesn't play ball, there's been stories. I don't know if Alan Moore got into this, but later writers got into this. There could be other avatars, and Alec Holland could be removed as the
Oh.
avatar.
So that's interesting. I would like to see how that plan like plays out because there is the thing of I'm going through something kind of like similar-ish in at work where say like they want to learn more about AI stuff, and I don't trust that people with power and money will use AI to benefit people. I see them like wanting to cut things, but so I was reluctant, but then I was like, but if anybody stands a chance to stop that from happening, I know that that's my intent and that's my goal. So like it's almost like I have to do something that I disagree with to make sure that it's not falling into the wrong hands, and I feel like with with the green, it's kind of like Alec. That's why I'm excited to read on, because like he would have to know, does he want to be done with it? But he also knows the good that like only he knows the good that he could do with it. So it's like, do you give that up and entrust it to someone else to kind of like do better than you, or do you just stay in and take the bull by the horns and try to steer things the way you want to go? So I didn't reach that part in my saga reading. I think I only made it partway through volume 3, so I'm very excited to get there. That's
Yeah.
very.
Well, this will be your opportunity, Josh, because we'll eventually get through all 6 volumes, and then and there was actually a great book, Joe. I don't know if you picked this up when it came out like last year, but there was a book called it was a 2-book like what are those larger editions called that DC does now, Joe? Those like big like magazine sized books that come out like what like
Oh,
super...
that's the Black Label line, probably.
Yeah. Right? They did one for SwampThing called Green Hell, which
I
is
didn't know
based.
that. Okay.
And I forget who it's written by, but the artwork's great. I think Jason Fabok might have been the artist on it, but but anyway, the story kind of picks up. It's loosely connected to the Alan Moore run, where it's years and years in the future, where Earth is like plant life is killing humans or something like that, and John Constantine is the last person, one of the last magicians on Earth, and he's like, well, there's only one thing I can do, and he basically brings Swamp Thing out of the paradise of the Green back to Earth to fight like this.
Oh,
interesting.
So
brutal.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's a brutal horror comic. So one, it's on brand for Halloween audience. So if you want to take a look at that,
Yeah.
Hoopla has it, but it's also beautifully drawn and grotesque, but also like another.
Sure it is.
But it's also like Swamp Thing. Like, I gotta do this again. Because like in the Paradise of the Green, he's there with Abby. He's there with his daughter. He's living a happy life, and then he's like, Constantine, like,
Yeah, I don't think he wants to see him.
Yeah, because Constantine, from what I read, going forward, he's the one that kind of plants the ideas in Swamp Thing's head of like, you have no idea the powers that you have, do you? Like, you could just do whatever you like.
Well, to kind of like, I guess we'll put a bow on this soon, because I know we keep talking on volume 1 forever, but that's what Jason Blood, I guess, kind of did in the last panel there. He was like, this is only the beginning of things to come, when they're kind of questioning what's going on with the Monkey King, and who is the person who had the kid's parents summon the Monkey King.
Oh, yeah.
So that's Alan Moore's, I guess, underlying
like someone like nudged their arms, right? Like that's like, yeah. So basically, the Ouija board was actually being a Ouija board, like the myth of a Ouija board, where it was moving on its own.
It was manipulated.
Yeah. Like, so that's cool.
So we'll get to see what's going on with all that as we go on.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about Volume 2 because it has. So as you guys know, I'm newer-ish to comic books, and there's the episode, like I said, when he goes into the Green, and then he meets the rhyming again, and there's like, is it Phantom somebody and some
Phantom
like
Stranger,
or Spectre or something,
Spectre,
and all the, because we talked about the X-Men the new X-Men cartoon, and there was that owl that was like basically like fear itself, and I love that character, and I think it's because it seems like it's out of Swamp Thing, right? Like it seems like he deals with all these weird, like Phantom Stranger or a monkey that eats on fear and everything like that. So I like all that weird stuff, and there was this issue in Volume 2 where he's encountering like all of that stuff, and he's like, oh, it's so good. I give a talk for an online church every once in a while, and I did a whole talk that tied in like spiritual themes from the Bible with Swamp Thing because I was so into it. Yeah, and it was I could send it to you guys offline if you wanted to listen to it.
No, it was good. I remember I enjoyed listening to it. Yeah, I listened to it. Yeah, it's good. Yeah. Volume 2 is great. That's one of my favorite stories. Is awesome. When he spoilers, audience, in Volume 2 when he descends into hell to save Abigail's soul. Which is like, like that's one of the most romantic things any of the superheroes has done. Is just
Orpheus.
So, well, as we wrap up, because let's just give, I guess, what are some final thoughts or impressions? Or Joe, I don't know, you had a whole list of things. Did we get through some of that, I hope?
Well, I think my final impression about this book. Now, I said I haven't read it in 40 years, so I do remember him descending into hell in the second part. But I wrote down that the trick with a book like this, and say The Phantom Stranger, is not to make the titular character a supporting character in his own book. It's very easy to do that in horror books, mystery books. But Alan Moore seems to be able to walk the line. He fleshes out all these other characters, whether they be villains or Abigail or even Matt. Something's up with Matt at the end of this, obviously. I mean, even he crashes into a tree and he swallows the bug, and now even the car is fixed. How the hell did that happen? All right, so mysticism, right? But it's fascinating to read this because he's walking this tightrope, and at no time does Swamp Thing become a supporting character in his own book, which is a problem with current comic books, especially Batman. But it never gets mundane. Everybody's involved in the narrative, and you just want to keep reading. I know I pulled these out of a box. I had to dig a box out, a long box. I didn't put the long box back because I'm going to continue reading. So
Awesome.
Brilliant.
Yeah, Well, we're gonna keep going with this. We have to be diligent about it so it doesn't again fall to another 3 years. It'll be 6 years.
Sure.
But Chris, what are your overall final thoughts of this volume? We'll be going to volume 2 at some point in the near future.
I mean, honestly, I'm reviewing some of the panels here on my phone. Again, hoopla, folks. But it's compelling. It's good. I enjoy reading it. I think, again, equal parts illumination and horror. I don't know. Again, I think we've said a lot about it. Like you said, James, we could keep talking about it. And that's really evidence of a good story. Do I have certain panels where I'm like, ooh, that close up on that character, that they look cross-eyed, like Jason Blood, that happens a couple of times? Yeah, for sure. And there are moments where, like you said earlier, Josh, I think Alan Moore is a little heavy-handed with what he's trying to say. But, I think overall, I think it's a book worth reading. I think it's interesting, again, compelling. I do like the balance of sort of spirituality, but also the horror of it. There are some panels that are drawn in a very horrifying way. And I think that some of the things that happen are horrifying by their nature. So yeah, really enjoyable book. Again, I was really happy for a reason to revisit it.
Yeah, I think he spans the gambit of it's all the horrors. It's psychological horror, it's situational horror, it's body horror. I don't think there's a frame of horror that he doesn't get to in 7 issues. Yeah, and also
hard to agree.
Yeah, and I also feel like he, you were saying some of those, some of the people look a little weird. My thing with the artwork is I enjoy the artwork. I think this is my best rendition of Swamp Thing, and of the way he's drawn, the way he looks. I've yet to see anyone actually do that, translated into a statue or an action figure that represents the Steve Bissette Swamp Thing. They do other versions of it, but no one's actually captured the way that Steve Bissette draws the character. But that being said, some of the human stuff is a little off or a little weird looking, or like I said to Joe, it's kind of grotesque looking. But I think that's part of the nature of the story he's trying to tell. Josh, overall final impressions of Volume 1?
Well, it was, so I was very limited, like I said, with comic books before this. I knew I was in the comic world in terms of video games and movies and growing up with X-Men, but as you guys know, I didn't know it nearly, you guys forgot more about X-Men than I ever knew, so it's, but when I read this, I did read The Watchmen before, but I never took it as anything other than a serious novel with illustrations in it, so this kind of alerted me to what a comic book could really be. And then hearing you guys talk about it, it seems too that Alan Moore somehow made advanced the mythos of Swamp Thing to a level no one even thought of before, but still kept all the touchstones of what made the character great, where in a lot of kind of reboots or remakes or sequels of movies that we're seeing now, they always seem to get all the wrong ideas from what their source material is. They're just oh, we need they like this, so let's double down on it. Let's do this, and they essentially they just fall short. But like I feel like Alan Moore, if I was in the room with him, I feel like you could hear him saying like, "Oh no, we're keeping the horror. It's just gonna be slightly different than you remember. It's oh no, we're keeping the monsters. It's just gonna be slightly different than you remember." And it like you could tell that it handles the subject matter with care and like wants to advance it for the good of the saga and the character rather than trying to do something new. It's almost like he saw potential that no one else saw for the character, and I think that's awesome. And then one thing that the last thing, because I went on all the rants about the spiritual and existential stuff, but the actual construction of it was really cool, where they did film editing techniques in a comic book, which was really crazy, where it would like the first sentence or word on the one panel finishes the thought of the previous page, but while starting a new scene, which is like you see that all the time in editing where there'll be people talking and then it cuts to another scene with other people, but they kind of are finishing that thought, so it helps like seamlessly blend the transition between scenes. And like that's happening in this comic book where someone's saying like, "But Abigail, you're my," and then the next thing is someone else saying, "Wife, where is she?" Like it's just like it carries that same sentence, but then uses it to divide into a different scene. And that I didn't know that you could do that in like a still medium and not just in like with editing like J cuts or whatever the fancy terms are. So that really stuck out to me that like, oh, they're using like filmmaking techniques in more than just the drawing. They're making like film edits and film cuts in this, and that was really cool. And then it's just I don't know, it makes you think and like like I said, talk for like an hour and a half about like was it 6 issues, 7 issues, and it's just and we're cutting it shorter for the sake of the listeners, and because like wrestling started an hour ago. But the other than that, we would just keep going forever, and that's only on the volume one. And so yeah, no, I'm a swamp thing head. I'm a swamp head.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't think Swamp Thing ever considered if he had fans what they would call him. So let's
Yeah.
Swamp Head's good
I'm a
enough.
I'm a swamp thing. There we go.
Let's
Like
make
we'll
a
do like
t-shirt.
we'll be the things. We're the swamp things.
um, well, we have when we do volume two, obviously this is an ongoing discussion about the thematics of volume one. So like some of the stuff, if we didn't dive into it now, be dived into deeper, especially as Alan Moore, I think, figures out the character more, or at least lets us in onto how the character is processing his own abilities, powers, and life now that he's realized what he truly is. So, a listening audience, I hope you've enjoyed.
Hold on, before we finish though, because James, this is Swamp Thing is you are Swamp Thing. This is we talk about Swamp Thing because of how much you enjoy and love Swamp Thing. So, if you wouldn't mind, 3 reasons from you why people should read this book. Go.
Oh well, I think it's a good. I think all the stuff we talked about. It's a good philosophical sort of story that's told in the medium of comics. I think this shows. Again, not that we're in a comic book podcast. We have to justify comic books to other people at this point, especially since like the MCU is like the biggest thing in the world right now still. But when people think about comic books, like this elevates like what comic books can do. Not that it needs to be elevated, but I think when people think of comics as like silly stories with guys wearing tights and fighting bad guys, this shows you like this is a medium that you can tell
serious
medium that has like deep thinking, as we're talked about it for like an hour plus at this point. So there's that too: philosophical, deep thinking, and if you like horror, I think it's a good ongoing horror series as opposed to an anthology, which I think people are looking for. I don't know if there's a lot of ongoing horror that's successful, to be perfectly honest. Like I'm not a big horror movie guy. Like I'm not a big like current horror movie guy with like I don't need more things freaking me out. Like Alan Moore's books are enough freaky enough. I don't need to like go there. But there's a lot of horror franchises that keep going, and as they go, they sort of lose something. Whereas Alan Moore got 6 volumes out of that, 7 issues of volumes. So how many years of that? How long was he telling that story, Joe? That's like
I don't know, till 1990 or so, maybe.
Yeah, that's a long
I'm not
run.
sure.
So
I think a
Maybe
lot of
beyond that.
horror, a lot of horror in movies is just you get like 2 hours slice of life from the worst night in this town's history, right? That's normally what you get in some degree. But with this Swamp Thing, like if you live in this horror world, it's not just a one-off thing. It's not something that just happens on Halloween or because a prisoner broke loose and is on a rampage. It's like you're living in this world of monsters and people, and sometimes people are better than monsters and monsters better than people. But it's just an ongoing world that just like keeps growing. Because as I'm reading this, I'm in this horror world and there's monsters fighting, and then like Superman's there, and I'm like, wait, so this is in like
It's in continuity.
yeah,
our
I was
world?
gonna
Like
say
yeah,
like
it's like
that's the important thing about this Swamp Thing run is like it's whatever Superman's doing, Swamp Thing is also doing something else at the same time. Like so, it's like
yeah.
I mean, eventually Swamp Thing does get moved to Vertigo way down the road, but Alan Moore wrote Swamp Thing within the DC universe proper, and the stuff he did, as we'll see later on with Crisis on Infinite Earth, like there's a Swamp Thing Crisis on Infinite Earth issue where he's like he mixes up with the Justice League and stuff again, and maybe volume 3 or 4. So anyway, so I'm going to keep going on, but if you have enjoyed this, audience, I hope you did. This is our deep dive into volume 1 of the Saga of Swamp Thing. We will be continuing on. But I could not have done this episode without my other hosts who gave us so much input and philosophical talk about this book. So thank you, Joe.
You're welcome, James. Stay out of the swamp.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, this was fun.
And thank you, Josh. And I'm glad we could convert you another, like when you converted on to Daredevil and Swamp Thing, they're both characters who could use some extra readers. So I'm glad you enjoyed it.
And thank you. Like it's for only meeting on that podcast. You need credit for you had me figured out. You knew what I would latch to and what I wouldn't. And anybody listening to this, if any comic books that these guys recommend, just like read them. They have not steered me wrong. The only comic I ever read that I didn't like, I specifically asked, I was like, give me a Punisher one. And everybody was like, we don't like Punisher, so we don't know any good ones. I was like, well, just anyone. And so you guys like kind of like scraped together one, and I read it. It's like, oh, I didn't really like it that much. But like, that was like, I forced your hand on that. Everything else has been gold. And so everybody read everything that they recommend. Trust me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the ringing endorsement, Josh. And listeners out there there might be a couple. If there is a good Punisher run, you can put it in the comments because I don't read Punisher. Joe is not a real Punisher person. Chris is not. So I'm sure every character has a writer who's given them like their gold storytelling. But you can put that in the comments anyway. Obviously, so listening audience, please put your thoughts in the comments section. If you have not following us already, please put your thoughts. You can reach us on the Instagram at Secret Origins MC. I'm sure Joe will send me pictures of his original issues of this book for me to post on the Instagram.
That's the anatomy lesson. That's the one.
There you go. Yeah, the original covers. So I'm sure those will pop up when this episode's posting. Oh, yeah. And if you're watching us on YouTube, if I got that far and put it on YouTube, like or subscribe or whatever you do with that. That's always great. And we always appreciate you listening. And we'll be back for another Halloween-themed episode next week. So we'll talk to you then.